of all, on the calendar, I want you to see, looking ahead, we have a couple of weird weeks coming up. So notice we've got no school on Monday, which is great. We have the PSAT day, no classes on Wednesday, and then the following Monday we have fall conferences. So it's kind of a weird, and then like homecoming is all throughout that. So it's a little crazy. But I just want you to notice that we do have a quiz coming up, 2.1 through 2.3. It's really 2.2 through 2.3 because 2.1 was just looking at the original sine and cosine graphs. So I hope you feel comfortable with that. I kind of polled you as you came in, and most of you seem to do okay with the notes and homework. And then I will take questions over 2.2. And then we're going to go over 2.3 notes, which isn't too difficult and too different from what we did in 2.2 notes. All right, so if you guys will get out your 2.2 problem set, and I would love to take any questions that you might have. Any questions on the problem set? Yes?
Did you show us how to do number 7?
7? Okay. All right, so remember, how many different things are you looking at when you're looking at, so I'm doing number 7, I'll do it in this white space here. So how many different things? 5? I think just 4. Yeah, just 4. So the 4 things you're looking for, I guess the 5th one would be whether it's like reflected across the x-axis, if you want to count that. Sure, yeah. Okay. So for number 7, so you've got the amplitude. What's the amplitude for number 7? 1, correct. Now, we see that it's negative, and that negative does what? Reflects across x-axis. X-axis, yeah. Okay, so amplitude is 1. What's next? So I go to kind of A, B, C, D. So B is, what number is B? It's the next number that you see. It's 1/2, right? It goes A, B, C, D. Okay, so A was 1, B is 1/2. Now, what does B inform us about? The period, correct. So if I have B, how do I find the period?
2 pi over whatever the number is.
2 pi over B, right? That's how you find the period. So then the period of this one is going to be 4 pi. Good? All right, now the next thing is finding the phase shift, which is the C. Is the C 5 pi over 3 or negative 5 pi over 3? No, it is not. What do you have to do before you can tell me the phase shift?
It out.
Correct. You have to factor it out. All right. So we have 1/2 times x plus what? 10 pi over 3. Yeah. Okay. So the phase shift, the C value, is actually going to be negative 10 pi over 3. Any questions so far? All right.
Negative because like it should be a minus.
Correct. Yeah. So when it's inside the parentheses, what I call the argument, was that a new word for you guys? Arguments? Yes? Okay. All right. That's something that you need to get used to. That's what that is called. So when you take the function of something, that of something in parentheses typically is called the argument. You'll hear me say that a lot. So just get used to me saying that. Okay? All right, so if it's inside the argument, it does the opposite of what you think, right? If I see a 1/2, it's actually going to stretch the horizontal component by a factor of 2, right? And if I see adding 10 pi over 3, it's actually going to shift to the left 10 pi over 3, right? Which is what you did in Algebra 2. All right, what about the midline? What's the D? 0. Does that mean there is no midline?
No, there is a midline.
There is a midline, it just didn't move, right? It's just the x-axis. So D is equal to 0. So that means that the midline is just the x-axis.
And even if it's assumed that the midline is 0, do you still want us to write it?
If I ask it, then yes, you would say, you wouldn't have to say D equals 0. You would just say, if I ask you for the midline, you would say Y equals 0, or you could say the x-axis is the midline. If I specifically ask for it, otherwise, no. Okay, so then you take all of that information and then you graph it. So let me see if I can fit this on here. All right, so I like to start with my writing the tick marks on each of my axes. All right, so my amplitude is 1 with a midline of 0. So I kind of look at my vertical transformations first. So I start at 0, go up 1, and go down 1. So that's going to be my Y tick marks. Then my X tick marks, I have a phase shift. That's where I want to start. So my phase shift is at negative 10 pi over 3. So that's where I'm going to start. How do I figure out where I end? Right, if I add the full period, not 2 pi, but 4 pi, then that's where I would end. So you could do it that way, or you could keep adding how much? A fourth of the period, right? Remember that? So if I add a fourth of the period 5 times, you get those 4 sections, those 5 points. Okay, so a fourth of the period is just pi. So if I take negative 10 pi over 3 and I keep adding pi. All right, so I'm going to erase this so that we can actually see that. So if I start at negative 10 pi over 3, that's my starting point. And then I want to add a fourth of a pi until I get to my final point. So I actually did a lot of work here. So I kind of organized my work really clearly here. So my start is negative 10 pi over 3. Then my second point is going to be negative 10 pi over 3 plus a pi. Right? Yeah, so that would really be, if I'm adding a pi, that would be 3 pi over 3. So that's correct. It would be negative 7 pi over 3. Eugene, you have a pass for me? Excellent. Eugene, we're going over problem set 2.2. Number 7. All right, so then the third point, you just keep doing that. So now I start at negative 7 pi over 3, and I add another whole pi, or 3 pi over 3.
And is it always going to be like 1/4 of the period? Correct,
because you want 5 points, or 4 sections, so you're adding a fourth of the period. Okay, so you just keep going until you get to your 5th point. So negative 4 pi over 3 plus 3 pi over 3. Everybody following? Any questions? This is as hard as it gets with these fractions, but if you just organize it clearly, it shouldn't be too bad. So then our 5th point is negative pi over 3 plus 3 pi over 3. So that gives me 2 pi over 3.
Is that like good to check? Or wait.
Yeah, and so you could also check if I went back and added a full period to negative 10 pi over 3. Right? The full period was 4 pi. So if I start at negative 10 pi over 3 and I add 4 pi, you should get to 2 pi over 3. So 4 pi over 3 in thirds is what, 12 pi over 3?
Yes.
Okay, and so negative 10 pi over 3 plus 12 pi over 3 is 2 pi over 3. So yes, that's a good way to check to make sure that you got to the right ending point. Okay? So those 5 points now that's what I would label my x-axis. Okay, and so we already saw it went from negative 1 to 1. Those are my 5 points. Do I need to show the actual graph, or is that good enough? That's the hardest part, right? And then it's just doing the shape of the graph after that. Yeah, I think that was the hardest one on there.
Just like a clarification question. So like the variable in front of the x is always like reversed because like you divide, but then
Correct.
5 pi over 3, you just have to worry about the sign.
It's adding, so it's the reverse of that, which would be subtracting. Yeah. Any other questions on this problem? Yeah.
So for the midline, can we say like, I think you might have said this before, but can we say like y equals 0?
Y equals 0.
Okay.
Yeah, or you could just say the x-axis, either one.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions on the problem set? How do we do on 9, the last 4, 9 through 12? Yeah, good, or pretty easy? Okay. Any other questions before we move on to the notes? 8, okay. All right, let me erase that. Okay, so 8 is really the same thing as number 7. So we see again that we need to pull out that constant multiple, right, in order to see that phase shift. So that's the first thing I look for, and the first thing that I do. So let's go ahead and pull out that pi over 2 times x minus what? 3, correct. Now this one, the only thing different is it does have a change in midline. It's not just the x-axis. Okay, so let's go ahead and identify everything. So the amplitude is 4. The period, what's the period? 2 pi over 2, which would be 4, correct. Okay, phase shift would be plus 3, and then my midline would be y is equal to 7. All right, so then when I do my tick marks, I have a midline of 7. Remember on the notes I did like what's called the range. So if my midline is at 7, to get kind of my range, you add and subtract the amplitude. So if I add the amplitude, what would be my maximum point? 11. What would be my minimum point? 3. Okay, so then that tells me how to label the y-axis. And then I have a phase shift of positive 3, so we're really only dealing with the first quadrant here. So I'm just going to draw the first quadrant. So I have a minimum value of 7 minus 4, which is 3. I have a maximum of 7 plus 4, which is 11. And then I put my midline of 7. So I don't get any more detail than that. Just show me those 3 points. Okay. All right, so then I know my midline is at 7, so I'm going to draw a dashed line there. And then for my tick marks, I have a phase shift of 3, so I know that's where I'm going to start. Now, I really like it when the pi's like cancel out because it makes it's a lot easier than number 7 where we had to deal with the fractions and the pi's. So this is much easier. So if I start at 3 and my period is 4, okay. Yeah, I'm just going to add 1, so it's really quite easy. So I'm going to end at 7. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yep. And then you can put in your points from there. Is that okay? Okay. Just as a reminder, where does sine start? On the midline, right? It's kind of a rhyme. Sine starts at the midline. All right, so then where does cosine start? On the amplitude, either the plus or minus the amplitude, depending on if it's positive or negative. Okay? Yeah? Generally feel pretty good about that lesson? Awesome. Great.